Moving to a rural town was supposed to be my escape, a way to leave behind the chaos of city life and find some peace. The town of Ravenwood had seemed perfect when I first arrived. Quaint, quiet, and far removed from the constant noise and bustle I had grown weary of. Nestled in a valley and surrounded by dense forests, the town seemed like a place where time had stood still, preserving its charm and tranquility. I had been living in Ravenwood for a month when I first heard about the abandoned village. It was a hushed topic among the locals, spoken of in whispers and often accompanied by wary glances. According to the stories, the village had been deserted decades ago, left to be reclaimed by nature. My curiosity was piqued, and as an amateur photographer always on the lookout for unique subjects, I decided to explore the area. On a cool, overcast morning, I packed my camera and a few essentials into a backpack and set out. The path to the village was overgrown, the trail barely visible under the tangled brush and fallen leaves. As I walked, the dense canopy of trees above filtered the sunlight, casting eerie, dappled shadows on the ground. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call. After an hour of hiking, I arrived at the outskirts of the village. The sight that greeted me was both fascinating and unsettling. Crumbling stone cottages, their roofs caved in and walls covered in ivy, stood like silent sentinels guarding secrets of the past. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I walked slowly, my camera clicking as I captured the haunting beauty of the abandoned place. It was in the heart of the village that I found the wishing well. Hidden behind a dense thicket, the well was easy to miss unless you were specifically looking for it. The stone structure was ancient, covered in moss and lichen, with a wooden roof that had long since rotted away. An old rusted bucket hung from a frayed rope, swaying gently in the breeze. Curiosity drew me closer. As I brushed away the overgrowth, I noticed an inscription on the stone, worn but still legible. "Make a wish, but be wary of what you desire." I chuckled to myself, thinking it was a charming piece of local folklore. The well looked like something out of a fairy tale, and the idea of making a wish was too tempting to pass up. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out a coin. It was a small gesture, a bit of fun to add to my adventure. Holding the coin tightly, I closed my eyes and whispered my wish. I wish for wealth. The coin slipped from my fingers and plummeted into the darkness below, the sound of it hitting the water faint and distant. As I walked back to my cottage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had done something significant, though I laughed it off as a flight of fancy. That night, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that only comes after a day spent in fresh air and physical exertion. The following morning, I was woken by the sound of something sliding across my doorstep. Groggy and still half asleep, I stumbled to the door and opened it to find an envelope. There was no name, no address. Just a plain envelope sealed with a single piece of tape. Puzzled, I picked it up and went back inside. Sitting at my kitchen table, I tore open the envelope and gasped. Inside was a thick wad of cash, far more than I had ever held in my hands before. My heart pounded as I counted the bills, the sum growing larger and more unbelievable with each passing second. I couldn't fathom where it had come from or why it had been left for me. The logical part of my mind tried to dismiss it as some sort of mistake or elaborate prank, but the timing was too perfect. I remembered the well and my wish. Was it possible that my wish had actually been granted? I laughed nervously at the thought, shaking my head. Wishes weren't real, and wells didn't grant them. But as the days passed, more envelopes appeared. Each time, they contained more money, and each time, they filled me with a growing sense of unease. It was too much to be a coincidence. The shadows in my house seemed darker, the silence deeper. I started to notice things out of the corner of my eye. Fleeting shapes that vanished when I turned to look. Whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. One evening, as I sat in my living room counting the latest envelope of cash, I felt a chill run down my spine. The room had grown unnaturally cold, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I glanced around, heart pounding, and caught sight of a shadow moving across the wall. It wasn't the shadow of anything in the room, and it moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. Fear gripped me, and I fled to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each more terrifying than the last. What had I done? What had I unleashed by making that wish? The next morning, I resolved to find out more about the well. I needed to understand what was happening to me. The sense of dread that had settled over my life was becoming unbearable, and I knew that the answer lay in the past, in the history of the well and the village. Desperation drove me to the local library, a quaint building that stood as a testament to the town's long history. Mrs. Dawson, the librarian, greeted me warmly. Her kind eyes contrasted sharply with the cold dread that had settled in my chest. "What brings you here today, dear?" she asked, sensing my tension. "I'm looking for information about an old well in the abandoned village nearby," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. Her smile faded. "The wishing well?" She led me to the back room, filled with dusty records and yellowed newspapers. It's been the subject of many dark stories over the years. The room was musty, filled with the scent of aged paper and forgotten secrets. I sat down at a worn wooden table, the surface scarred with decades of use, and began sifting through the brittle pages. Each story deepened my dread. The well granted wishes, but always with a cruel twist. There was the farmer who wished for a bountiful harvest, only to see his crops destroyed by a plague of locusts. Another account told of a young woman who wished for beauty, but suffered a disfiguring accident. The pattern was clear. The well's gifts came with a terrible price. Just as I was about to leave, Mrs. Dawson mentioned an elderly woman who might know more. Agnes lives on the outskirts of town. She's been around longer than anyone and might have some answers for you. That afternoon, I found myself standing before a small, weathered cottage at the edge of the forest. The garden was overgrown, and the house looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open to reveal an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes and a face etched with deep lines. "Agnes?" I asked tentatively. "Yes, that's me." "What brings you here, young lady?" she replied, her voice surprisingly strong. I explained my situation, and Agnes listened intently, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she nodded slowly and began to tell me her own story. Decades ago, she had made a wish at the well. She wished for her sick husband to recover. Her wish was granted, but her husband came back changed, a hollow shell of the man he once was. He became distant, and strange occurrences began to plague their home. Agnes realized too late that the well's gifts came with a horrific cost. "You must be very careful," Agnes warned. "The well twists your desires into nightmares." Desperate to end the bizarre occurrences, I decided to return to the well and make another wish. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I made my way back to the abandoned village. The journey was fraught with fear. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. When I finally stood before the well again, I felt a mixture of anger and fear. The inscription seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, and an eerie presence surrounded me. With trembling hands, I tossed another coin into the well and wished for the disturbances to stop. As the coin disappeared into the darkness, the air around me grew colder, and the forest fell silent. I hurried back to my house, the oppressive calm settling in once again. For the first time in days, the whispers and shadows seemed to recede. Initially, the house felt calmer. The whispers had ceased, and the shadows no longer danced on the walls. But soon, I began to notice something was off. The quiet was too deep, almost suffocating, and an unnatural coldness seeped into every room. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. One night, I woke up to find my house completely silent and unnaturally dark. My breath was visible in the freezing air despite it being the middle of summer. The stillness was oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The darkness was so complete that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the light switch, but it failed to work. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the power was out. The air felt heavy, almost tangible, like a suffocating blanket. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the oppressive silence. Suddenly, shadows began to coalesce in the corners of the room, forming into a ghostly figure. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding silently across the floor. The figure's presence was palpable, and a cold dread seeped into my bones. My breath came in ragged gasps, visible in the freezing air. The figure whispered in my ear, its voice a chilling hiss that sent shivers down my spine. "You cannot escape your wish," it murmured. "The well's curse is upon you." The figure revealed itself as a manifestation of the well's curse, a harbinger of doom for those who made wishes without understanding the consequences. It taunted me, driving me to the brink of madness. The shadows twisted and danced around me, and I could feel my sanity slipping away. Desperate to escape the horror, I stumbled out of bed and made my way to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were unyielding, as if the house itself had become a prison. I was trapped, forced to confront the malevolent presence that I had unleashed. The ghostly figure continued to whisper, recounting the tragic fates of others who had made wishes at the well. Each story was more horrifying than the last, and I could feel the weight of their despair crushing me. The room grew colder, and I could see frost forming on the windows and walls. The figure's voice grew louder, more insistent. "You brought this upon yourself," it hissed. "You must pay the price." In a desperate attempt to end the torment, I screamed at the figure, demanding to know what I could do to stop the curse. The figure paused, its hollow eyes boring into mine. "There is no escape," it whispered. "You must suffer for your greed." I sank to the floor, my body racked with sobs. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a nightmare. The shadows closed in around me, and the whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind. As the night wore on, I was tormented by visions of my own demise. The figure showed me scenes of my life unraveling, each one more horrifying than the last. I saw myself losing everything I had worked for, my friends and family turning away from me, and my life descending into chaos. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the frosted windows, the figure faded away, leaving me alone in the silence. The oppressive cold lifted, but the fear remained. The days following my encounter with the ghostly figure were a blur of fear and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every whisper a reminder of the curse I had unleashed. I knew I had to do something to end this nightmare, but I was at a loss for how. The oppressive silence of my house felt like it was suffocating me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly watched. Driven to the edge of my sanity, I returned to Agnes, the old woman who had warned me about the well. Her cottage felt like a sanctuary compared to my own home. As I entered, the scent of herbs and the warmth of a fire greeted me, a stark contrast to the cold dread I had been living with. "Agnes, I need your help," I pleaded, my voice shaking. "The well's curse, it's driving me mad. How can I break it?" Agnes looked at me with a mixture of pity and sorrow. "There is one way," she said slowly, "but it's risky. The well is ancient and powerful, and its curses are not easily undone. You can make a final wish to try and reverse the effects, but you must be careful. The well will twist your desires in unimaginable ways. Desperation gave me the courage to try. That evening, as the sun set and the sky turned a deep, foreboding shade of purple, I made my way back to the abandoned village. The path felt more menacing than ever, every rustle and snap in the underbrush amplifying my fear. The village was eerily silent, the crumbling buildings and overgrown streets now more sinister than ever. The well stood at the center of it all, as if waiting for me. The stones seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air around it was thick with an oppressive, almost tangible sense of dread. When I reached the well, I hesitated, feeling the weight of my actions. The inscription glowed eerily in the twilight, and the atmosphere crackled with malevolence. My hands trembled as I reached into my pocket, pulling out a coin. With a deep breath, I tossed it into the well and made my final wish. For everything to return to the way it was before I discovered the well. The coin fell into the darkness with a faint splash, and the ground around the well shuddered. A violent force erupted from the well, throwing me backward. I landed hard on the ground, pain shooting through my body. As I struggled to get up, I saw the ground around the well cracking open, and dark mist seeped out, swirling ominously. The mist spread quickly, enveloping the well and creeping toward me. I scrambled to my feet, fear gripping my heart. The mist felt alive, as if it were reaching out to claim me. I turned and ran, the village and the well disappearing into the darkness behind me. When I woke up the next morning, I found myself in my bed, disoriented. The room was warm, and sunlight streamed through the windows. For a moment, I thought my wish had worked. Everything seemed normal. The oppressive silence and the cold dread were gone. I let out a sigh of relief, feeling a glimmer of hope. As I got up and went about my day, I began to notice small, unsettling changes. Objects in my house were slightly out of place, as if someone had moved them. The photographs on the walls seemed to depict scenes I didn't remember. My favorite mug, usually kept on the kitchen counter, was now in the living room. These changes were subtle, but they gnawed at me, making me feel uneasy. Outside, the people in the town acted oddly. Neighbors who were usually friendly now seemed distant, their smiles never reaching their eyes. They greeted me with a familiarity that felt forced, as if they were pretending to be people I knew. As I walked down the street, I caught glimpses of shadows that seemed to follow me, disappearing when I turned to look. The unsettling feeling grew stronger with each passing hour. I decided to visit Mrs. Dawson at the library, hoping she could offer some comfort or explanation. The library felt different, the familiar musty scent replaced by a faint, acrid smell. Mrs. Dawson greeted me with her usual warmth, but there was something off about her. Her eyes seemed darker, and her movements were jerky, almost puppet-like. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, her voice sounding slightly distorted. I nodded, trying to hide my unease. "Just feeling a bit out of sorts," I replied, forcing a smile. As I left the library, the shadows seemed to press in closer, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I hurried home, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached my house, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing thoughts. It was then that I realized the horrifying truth. The well had granted my wish, but it had twisted it. I was trapped in a distorted version of my life, where everything was almost normal, but not quite right. The malevolent presence I had unleashed was still with me, haunting me in this twisted reality. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping closer, and the whispers started again, echoing in my mind. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a prison. The true cost of my wishes was now clear, and I knew that I would never escape the nightmare I had brought upon myself. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face as the full weight of my actions settled over me. The well's curse had consumed my life, and I was left to wander this distorted reality. forever haunted by the malevolent presence that I had unleashed.